Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz, and this season we will be unpacking real trends, hot topics in the workplace around allyship and inclusion. Our goal is that each week you leave with tangible tools, information, practical strategies that you can take back to allies at your organization. Let's dig in to this week's topic. Hey, listeners, welcome back. We've got Dr. Janice Gassam Assare. Sorry, she just corrected me on how to spell her last name, and look at me correcting myself in action. I'm so excited for everyone to meet Dr. Janice. She has over 10 years of experience facilitating racial dialogue and educating others about equity and inclusion. The work she does is inspired by her mom and her willingness to speak up and speak out against the oppressive systems that she had to navigate in her workplace. Ditto. I can so resonates with me. Through the strength and perseverance personified by her mom, she's invigorated to be the change she seeks in the world and the workplace. Dr. J centers her work around the liberation of Black people and more specifically Black women. The reason for this is echoed in the words of the Combahee River Collective, and I may have said that incorrectly, so Janice can correct me if I did. But I do want to read the quote that's so beautiful in her bio. It says, if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all of the systems of oppression. So beautifully said. Dr. Janice, welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you so much, Julie. It's so wonderful to be here, and thank you for inviting me to have this conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I know your mom was a huge inspiration for your work, and likewise, since I can remember, my mom was always my shiro and always pushed me to challenge things. And I can imagine for you that was even more central as an inspiration for your work. So tell us about the journey. Being the author of the book Decentering Whiteness in the Workplace is a big topic nowadays. How did you get here? And I'd love to know what inspired you specifically to write the book.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think really watching what my parents went through. So my parents, just for context, immigrated to the US from Cameroon, which is a country in Central Africa, next to Nigeria. So they got here in the 80s, and just watching, what my mom was a stay-at-home mom until later on, until we were teenagers. Right. So watching specifically what my dad went through, he worked in academia and he experienced a lot of racism and xenophobia, not only being Black, but being a Black man with an accent, who didn't maybe know all of the nuances of the culture here. And then when my mom entered the workplace, really watching everything she went through, both of them were educators. And, the discrimination my mom faced for her accent, and people would hear her speak, and the way that they speak to her is just so interesting. I remember being young and my mom would always be like, "Can you just call this company for me? Because they'll respond better to you." Because on the phone, my mom was always like, "You sound white, so people will, respond better to you." So just watching like what they experienced really intrigued me. And I was always just fascinated with like the workplace, because so many of us, whether we're business owners or whether we work in corporate or academia, we spend a lot of time just working. And a lot of people who have to work in an office with other people don't have the best experiences. So I was always intrigued by just the psychology, right? That's always been interesting to me. When I was in undergrad, I studied psychology because I was just like, people are so fascinating. And then like people's behaviors in the workplace. And so that's what really got me interested in like going into organizational psychology. And then I think just my parents' experiences really moved me to want to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, even though back then I didn't even know what it was called. I was just like, I'm interested in race and racism and learning why people are the way that they are and treat people a certain way because of the color of their skin. So I think just that always really sort of intrigued me, and just understanding, people's motivations and why we do the things that we do.
Yeah, the accent piece, like the intersectionality piece, I think is so interesting with your mom's story and certainly your story. Like there's multiple dimensions of diversity at play, but really, you make a great argument in the book that race is really the focal point. And I'm curious, like, you thinking about when we focus on the most marginalized first, right? And thinking about especially women of color, why is that so important? Why does that help us all be better?
That's such a great question. So I think it's important for us to understand all of our oppressions are interconnected. And so the same systems that marginalize me as a Black woman marginalize someone who is disabled, marginalize someone who is Muslim or someone who is Jewish or someone who is. So we're all, impacted by these systems of oppression. And if you focus on who is most harmed by the system and create supports for them, other communities will benefit. And I think a really great example that I mentioned in the book and that I can't take credit for, but it was a brilliant writer by the name of Amira Barger. She talked about the curb cut effect, which I wasn't familiar with, but the curb cut effect, essentially, like a curb cut is when you're walking on a sidewalk, it's that part of the sidewalk that lets you transition into the street. And initially, it was created for people with disabilities or people in wheelchairs so that they could easily transition from the sidewalk into the street. So it's created for that community of people who are marginalized. But what's interesting is that it benefits everyone. If you're a bike rider, the curb cut helps you transition very easily into the street. If you have a stroller and you're with a child, it's helpful for you. If you have a skateboard or you're rollerblading or roller skating, it's super helpful for you. So that's an example of a particular system that was created, or a support that was created for that marginalized community that ends up benefiting other groups. And I think another really good example is closed captioning. I am a huge closed captioning fan because I'm a night owl and my partner is not a night owl. So I will spend time scrolling late at night when I'm in bed already. And I know the sleep specialists say not to do that, but I will spend time scrolling. And if I want to watch a video, a lot of videos aren't closed captioned. Now, I'm not deaf or hard of hearing, but having closed captioning, which is something very specific to that community, helps me as well. Or if you're at work or if you're in the post office and you want to watch a movie or you want to watch something, right? Sometimes I say post office because I just came from there, and sometimes the lines are long and you just want to scroll social media, but I don't want to be rude to the people around me. So I think that's another example of, like, it was created for that the community of deaf and hard of hearing people, but it positively impacts me. And so I think that when we consider our workplaces in that way, it benefits us to think about, like, who is most marginalized and how do we create support so that they are liberated, because that will help all of us to be liberated. I think the way that equity is positioned right now and some of the DEI, anti-DEI propaganda is that it's like a zero-sum game and it's somehow benefiting certain communities to the detriment of other communities. But it's important for us to understand that any supports that are created for oppressed or marginalized communities will help all of us. Because, for example, no one knows, you don't know if tomorrow you might wake up and you might be part of the disabled community, right? Anything could happen. And so if you are a person that was advocating for the rights of people with disabilities, and then tomorrow you become disabled, you're going to be impacted by those very same systems that you thought, wouldn't affect you because you're not part of that group. And so I think it's important for us to think about, and it's hard as Americans for us to think collectively about how what one person does or what one community experiences has a trickle down effect and impacts us all. But I think it's important for us to think about it in that way.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things I took away from your book too is just really looking at the data and the employee experience. So when you think about the workplace, who is the most marginalized? Who is having the most negative experience in the workplace, and centering efforts on making it better for them, like you said, then it makes it better for everyone. And sadly, and when we review that data, it's often with our clients, it's often people with intersectional identities. So women of color, of course, but folks with disabilities that also are in the LGBTQ plus community. There's, great intersections that you've drawn here. Back to white centering and thinking about what that means. Dr. Janice, would you mind explaining what it is? I love how you started right off of the heavy hitters at the beginning, like white supremacy, white centering. What are they and how are they different? Can you explain it to our audience?
Yeah, so when I think about white centering, I think about the system that prioritizes white people and white culture to the detriment of non-white communities, right? And there's a whole nother conversation that we can have about how whiteness as a system harms white people, right? But that's a whole nother conversation. I think I like touched on it in little parts in the book, but I didn't go into detail. But there's this misconception that white supremacy and whiteness as a system only harms non-white people, but there's also aspects of the culture and the system that harm white folks. And so when I say white centering, I think white centering is an aspect of white supremacy culture, right? Or it's a tenant, I guess you could say, or a component of white supremacy culture, which is just, this system that prioritizes white people and puts them above non-white communities. And so when we think about white centering, there's so many ways that whiteness is centered in our lives, in our workplaces, right? In the book, I go into detail about how I've centered whiteness because I think people might see the book on the surface and say, okay, of course, a Black woman is writing about whiteness and telling white people about how racist they are. And it's like, actually, that's not really what it is. It's me really going into detail through a lot of my own experiences about how I've witnessed whiteness being centered, how I've centered whiteness, right? The chapter on how I've centered whiteness was probably the hardest chapter to write because I had to be really honest and candid in ways that I hadn't fully admitted to myself, right? Even my disdain when I was younger for rap music was rooted in, I think, my desire to center whiteness. And I felt like I went to predominantly white schools and I wanted to fit in and I wanted the kids to like me. And I felt like back then when I was young, kids were listening to like Spice Girls, right? We weren't like the kids in my school weren't listening to rap music. And so I wanted to do whatever the kids in the cool club were doing. And that didn't involve listening to rap music, right? Even though my brother and my sister loved rap music, my dad loved rap music. I just was like, I want to be liked. And that involves not liking this, right? And so there are things that I was embarrassed as I was writing it. It was like, the fact that I didn't want to go to a historically Black college or university, and my father taught at a number of Black universities and colleges, and I just felt like there was something lesser than about those universities. So I've centered whiteness in so many ways, and I'm hoping that in speaking about that, it will trigger, but in a good way, it will sort of trigger something in the reader for them to say, wow, I've actually centered whiteness in these ways, and I haven't really reckoned with it. I think, of course, there's a conversation for white readers to have about ways that they've centered whiteness and they continue to center whiteness. But I also hope non-white readers don't dismiss the book and really take it in and think about ways within our marginalized communities that we still center whiteness. This is something I hear a lot from my friends who are in the queer community, and they talk about how, like, I've heard people say here in New York City how pride is very white, right? And so when I got here, I was like, "Ooh, I want to experience pride. I want to see what it's like. And I went with one of my roommates who was also my friend. He was white. And pride, I didn't think about it until somebody said it to me. And they were like, pride is very white. Like the aesthetic and everything about it. And I didn't even think about that. I just assumed because it's a celebration of being, part of the LGBTQIA plus community or being an ally, it was just kind of like, I didn't think about the nuances of like maybe how it prioritizes whiteness or white gay men. And so that was a whole conversation where I was like, oh, that's so interesting. This person I was speaking with was from Atlanta, and they were like, oh, New York and San Francisco prides are very white. And I've been to both of those. Right. And so I was like, that's so interesting. And so I think, it's just like really important for us all to be having the conversation, even non-white people. I think you might tune out and say, "Oh, this book is for white people," right? One of my best friends, when she found out I was writing this book, she was like, "Oh, you're writing a book for white people." And I was like, "No. Whiteness, even in the absence of white people, whiteness can still be centered." And so I hope that that's like one of the takeaways that people get from the book.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah. Even in the absence of whiteness, it can still be centered. When I read the book, I kept thinking about a fish bowl, the fish swimming in the fish bowl. I was like,
Mhm.
you can't see you're inside the bowl because you're inside the bowl. And that's what whiteness feels like to me. Like as a white person that was raised in whiteness, um, and luckily I had a few friends of color, but not nearly as many as I would have liked to have had. You just didn't get that exposure or that challenge to the system. And so everything became default. And I
Mhm.
think even for folks of color, you still fall into that default, whether it's like you said, the music you consume, the college choice you make. What does professionalism look like, right? Like hair,
Yeah.
clothing, speech, all of these things. Because and I really try to like take the whiteness out of me, but it's like, this is who I am, though. I don't think I should change it, but being cognizant of it, like you said, when you're in a situation, that's what I took away. Just be cognizant of what norms are being created, what's accepted in these spaces, what's not accepted in these spaces, what messages are we sending, either actually sending or subconsciously, a lot of times sending of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, because I think that's where whiteness really confines us all. The perfectionism trap of whiteness. I
Yeah.
don't adhere to, luckily, but I see it a lot with especially DEI practitioners. You can't say that. You have to be perfect. And it's like, it just
Yeah.
feels so if there was one word I could use to describe it, it just feels very constraining to all humans, to your point, not just white people or people of color. It hurts us all.
Mhm. Yeah, that's such a great point, though, even within the DEI space. And I'm sorry if you're hearing a dog, it's my neighbors. But even in the DEI space, right, it's something that is we see it a lot where it's like you don't want to say the wrong thing because these are corporate clients, these are corporate leaders, these are people of quote unquote status. And so you want to make sure you say the right thing on the discovery call so that they want to move forward with you and hire you. But I think that there's so many ways. And I have a chapter in the book on how DEI practitioners center whiteness and how I even centered whiteness in the DEI work that I've done. And when I started my consultancy, I started my DEI consultancy in 2018. And when I started in 2018 and even parts of 2019, I really wanted to get clients. And so whenever clients would reach out and say, "Can you do a workshop?" But we don't want you to. I remember one specific client was
Don't
like, "We
talk
don't."
about privilege, though, right? Yeah, like
Yeah,
don't
I mean,
mention
yeah, they
that
were like,
word.
"Don't talk about white privilege, white supremacy." We want it to be like we want people to be open to it, right? We want you to focus more on allyship and mentorship and like, it was like bridging the gap and emotional intelligence. And I was like, those things are important, right? I guess you could say I didn't have the backbone at that point to really, and I didn't realize I was centering whiteness. I just thought I was doing what I had to do to secure clients. And then I had my own awakening in 2020 where I started interrogating the way that I approach this work. And I realized, okay, if I'm centering whiteness, I will not be able to help oppressed communities achieve liberation through centering whiteness. And so I started pushing back when it's like, can we do an allyship or an emotional intelligence? And it's like, yeah, we can, but also like we have to talk about the systems of harm that are perpetuated and how whiteness as a system is prioritized in our workplaces in different ways and how we can work to start to dismantle that. Because I felt like before I wrote the book, when I was speaking with my publisher, they were like, do research when you submit, I had to submit my book proposal. They were like, do research and let us know like what other books on whiteness in the workplace are out there. And surprisingly, when I did research, I didn't see any books on whiteness or white supremacy in the workplace. I saw a lot of books on white supremacy in the world, right? And the author who wrote the foreword of my book, she's a New York Times bestselling author, and she wrote this book, Me and White Supremacy. Me and White Supremacy or Me and My White Supremacy. I always mix it up. But it ended up being a New York Times bestseller. And so she, has a book on white supremacy. There's tons of books on whiteness and white supremacy, but I didn't see anything specifically on whiteness in the workplace. So I was like, oh, this is something that needs to be explored in more detail.
Yes, I love that book. And I love how it fits with like a daily reflection too. Me and White Supremacy. Yeah, I was just looking for it on my bookshelf to see what the actual
Oh, yeah.
title was. We'll link to it in the
Yeah.
show
I
notes.
always add the me and my white supremacy, but I think it's just me and white supremacy.
Yeah,
It's
I
just
think
like very simple, but I always mess it up.
but there it's like a 28-day guide, so you can break it
Mhm.
down day by day. It's yeah, really helpful. And I love that she wrote the foreword for you. I think there's two things that come up to me with what you said, so forgive me, kind of a two-pronged question here. One, how many DEI practitioners are white? It's like alarming. As somebody that is white that does DEI work, self-admitted, I'm contributing to this problem. Because I do think it's really important that white people talk about this too. And when we have conversations of race, of course, we need to involve people with lived experience. Absolutely. Um, but given that there's so many white DEI practitioners, what do they do to make sure that we don't center whiteness? Like, I struggle with this, and not to get ask you for free advice on my own, but allyship is something I feel really comfortable talking about from my lived experience. But you're right, it's the systems, it's the deeper stuff we've got to keep pushing on. So I kind of see it as like, let's keep them like psychologically safe with something like allyship and inclusive leadership, and then like weave in the other stuff.
Yeah.
But what do
Yeah,
you
no, and I
recommend?
mean that's what I've done in all honesty, Julie. I've done that where if I have determined that a client really needs certain work, I might agree to, I don't do like a bait and switch where I say, okay, this is going to be about, allyship, and then I start talking about anti-blackness. But I will like definitely mention certain topics or try to sneak them in, right? Because I'll check the temperature and try to, because you can't have a conversation about like, okay, mentorship. I could talk about mentorship, but I also want to talk about what are the barriers to people advancing, right? And why is this mentorship program necessary? Well, historically, there are certain communities that have been disenfranchised and that haven't had the same opportunities. And so I would probably go into detail about why mentorship is actually so important for different racially marginalized communities. And so I think that there's a way to like talk on the surface about something, but also go a little bit deeper. But to go back to your question, yeah, I think it's important for all of us to be talking about this, right? I know people have different schools of thought. I think it's important for everyone to be talking about this, not just non-white people, because it is exhausting and it can get exhausting when you are the main person, right? Let's say you're not even a DEI person, you're just an employee who's non-white. And when something happens, you might be called on to lead the DEI efforts in your organization, and it can be exhausting. right? But I think it's important to name those things, right? If I'm a white DEI practitioner, I would even name that and say, you probably had more of a likelihood to hire me because I am a white person. And even in the space, the systems we're trying to dismantle are replicated. Just like I try to be really open about the fact that although I am a Black woman, I'm a lighter skinned Black woman. And because of colorism and my proximity to whiteness, my educational privilege, people are probably more drawn to me than somebody who maybe doesn't have a college education or who's maybe darker skinned or who is in a larger body than me. So there's all of these things that play a part in the fact that, there's thin privilege, there's skin color privilege, there's all of these things. And so I try to name that, right? And the same way that white people are very present within the DEI space, I think lighter skinned people, that was something I talked about in the book, where when you looked at which activists and anti-racism experts got elevated after the murder of George Floyd, a lot of them, if they weren't white, were lighter skinned Black people. And so it was a really interesting conversation when you think about, like, yes, it's important that we're talking about this, but it's also important who the message is coming from. So I try to name that in the work that I do, and I try to just like point out the fact that maybe you are more drawn to me as an educator because of these privileges that I have and these factors that I have, but how important it is for me to also be interrogating the same systems that I'm trying to like help organizations work through. And so I think when it comes to white folks in this space, accountability is so vital. Like, who are you surrounding yourself with? Who's holding you accountable? Because when you're working with organizations, they're looking to you as the experts. They're like, okay, Julie is our expert. She knows everything, right? Even though I might be a DEI practitioner and I'm very specific and like I do racial equity work, people will still come to me and say like, okay, we have this issue with our Jewish employees. What should we do? And, even though it's like I have a very specific expertise, just like I'm sure if you are a doctor, if you're a podiatrist, right? You specialize in feet. I'm sure you're still getting questions on heart, right? On lungs, on these things that it's like, okay, that's not my specialty or my expertise. And so I think it's important that we are recognizing and acknowledging, the fact that there may be a lot of white folks in this space, but how am I holding myself accountable? Because I'm looked at as an expert by everyone in this organization, but who's holding me accountable? And I think for me, the community, whether that's like people on LinkedIn or people I'm connected with, if I've said things or done things that people are like, Janice, that is not it. People have no issue like coming to me and kind of expressing, and I would want people to do that if I ever said or did anything that went against my values, right? So I think the community that you surround yourself with as a DEI practitioner is really important, as well as like thinking about who's holding you accountable. How are you expanding? Because as DEI practitioners, we don't know, like we don't know everything there is to know. I don't know everything there is to know about every aspect of. So I think that I try to be really open and candid and honest about that. And then I'm like, okay, I don't know about the trans experience. Who can I follow or who can I learn from who can teach me about that experience? So I think that the accountability piece is really important. I wouldn't say every white DEI practitioner should just quit and be like, I'm not doing this anymore, but it's important that you're checking yourself and you're holding yourself accountable.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. You might have felt more comfortable hiring me because I'm white and just being honest about that. And colorism, like you said, fair-skinned, lighter-skinned folks, the preference we have because of the proximity to whiteness. So interesting. One of my favorite parts of the book was how you really got to systemic change. I think we really struggle, and you make a great case, like, and I felt this way forever, like individual training on empathy and emotional intelligence, like, great, but that's one person's behavior. Like, we need a collective effort to dismantle the systems that's holding everyone back. But companies like that check the box. We did the allyship program, we did the inclusive leadership, we did the mandatory DEI training. Feels safer, I feel like, than going after systems that feel like we're changing the status quo, which we know is necessary for this work to work. So I know there's a huge chunk of your book dedicated to this, but if you could just summarize it in a few minutes, and listeners, that's why you need to buy the book, Decentering Whiteness in the Workplace. But there's key steps in the recruiting process, the hiring process, how we manage performance, promotions, pay increases. If you could just give us a little bit of an overview of things to look out for that we might be centering whiteness, well, we likely are in all of those phases, and maybe some ways to root it out.
Oh my gosh, there's so many. So, but like
I know that
some,
was an unfair question to ask you right at
well,
the end. I
yeah,
was like,
because
if I
I'm
don't
like,
ask it,
I
I'm going to be so disappointed.
no, I'm like, I could talk about this forever. So I think there's so many ways whiteness is centered in the hiring process, right? I think just even when we're looking at a resume, who we decide to hire. In the book, I talk about applicant tracking systems, which a lot of larger and mid-sized workplaces utilize, right? If you're an organization that gets thousands of resumes, you don't have a recruiter looking through all of those, right? And so even in how the applicant tracking systems are programmed, they're programmed to sort of filter out applicants based on certain keywords on their resume. And so what research has found is that women are more likely to be negatively impacted by applicant tracking systems and underrepresented racial groups, right? Because there's certain things that may be on our resume that are filtered out and put us in the no file. And so even something like that, right? But when you are looking at a resume, we know all about name bias and how what your name is could influence as a hiring manager, I might not want to hire you because, okay, this person sounds Black, right? There was a study on, the names Keisha and Jamal specifically. But there was also a study done in Sweden where they looked at Swedish names versus Muslim names. And unsurprisingly, they found that people with Swedish sounding names were more likely to get callbacks on their resume. So even if you remove someone's name, you might be able to see their gender, based on a women's group that they're in or a religious organization that they're part of, right? Sometimes people have they might volunteer at their religious institution and they have that on their resume, right? Or they might have served in some way, or they might have gone to a historically Black college or university. So there are indicators of that, and even like age, right? I don't have when I graduated on my LinkedIn because of age bias and age discrimination, but there's a lot of things on a resume that could indicate a person's race. And so just even in the resume, but once you get into once you are here in the workplace, our decisions of who to hire, or excuse me, who to promote and advance is often rooted in whiteness. That talk about sitting on a hiring committee and we didn't even have a rubric. We were just told hire or essentially give priority to whoever you think is best suited for the role. And that was the only instructions. And I was like, I don't even know much about the role. Am I looking at experience? Am I looking at their background? Like, what am I? So I created a rubric and shared it with the hiring committee. They did not use the rubric. But even in who we decide to advance, when you think about what are they called? And the name is escaping me. And I literally just talked about this last week. But which employees you tap to progress in their careers and to
Oh,
sort of
high
train
potential.
high potential, but there's a specific name for it. And I always forget it put um where you put employees who are high potentials you essentially nurture them into leadership roles, right? There's bias in that, right? And in who we tap on to be leaders within the
Oh,
organization. So
succession planning.
succession planning,
All
yes.
right. Oh, wait, I
I
knew
don't
we'd
know
get there.
why that always escapes me because it
Well,
was
it doesn't sound natural. It sounds like something that happens out in the wild or something.
exactly. It's so yes. So succession planning, what was behind your decision to promote this particular person or to put them in development programs? And so there's bias in that and white centering in that because a lot of non-white employees don't necessarily possess the qualities that we think about when we think about leaders. The bamboo ceiling is a particular type of bias that Asian American employees experience where they might be represented in an organization, but they have difficulty ascending because when we think about what it means to be a leader, we're not thinking about the specific traits that a lot of Asian American employees have or that they embody. So there's so many ways, that whiteness shows up in the ways that our workplaces are function and run, even in our perception of professionalism, how we expect people to dress, in our benefits policies. I'm like, I could go on and on and on about this, but those are just a few examples. But I think when you start thinking about and peeling back the layers, who is listened to in a meeting, right? Women are talked over and interrupted much more often than our counterparts, but women of color are experienced that at an even higher frequency. So even in the meetings, whiteness is centered. And so there's so many ways that when you start peeling back the layers, you start to see like, okay, this is really this is a really big issue.
Yeah. And I get that argument a lot, like, well, it's just a meeting, Julie. It was just an interruption. It's like, but the cumulative effect of those interruptions, it's minimizing to you if you don't feel as important as others that don't seem to have to give as much effort to be heard. And meetings are a snapshot of culture. I love the idea of really inspecting meetings for inclusion. I was at a client site recently where they had inclusive meeting tips on the wall of every meeting room. And there was nothing profound. It was like, watch out for interruptions, make sure that the virtual participants participate. And it was just like a nice reminder in that setting to make sure that you're being inclusive. And yeah, and whiteness is centered in a lot of those experiences, like you said, from hiring to succession planning to meeting behavior. And I really like how your book has specific recommendations for each one of those processes that people can take action on. Dr. J, I've taken up plenty of your time today. Thanks for sharing it with me, and thanks for putting this amazing book out in the world. It's different than any DEI book that I've read, and I've read a lot of them. And it's different than a lot of anti-racism books too, because like you said, it's for everyone. It's not just for white people. It's for everyone, because we're all swimming in that fishbowl. Pardon my analogy, but it's just what I kept thinking of when I was reading it. So we're all soaking in it. We just don't even know until you take a step back and look at it. But if you could just tell our listeners real quick how they could follow you and stay in touch with your work.
Yeah, I'm most active on LinkedIn. So if any of the listeners are on LinkedIn, you could find me at Janice Gassam Assare on LinkedIn. I do the other socials, but I'm not as active. Like I'm on Instagram under the same name. But I think LinkedIn is like where I like to be because there's the other DEI folks up there. I can learn from other people, read a lot of things. So LinkedIn is definitely where you can find me.
Awesome. Well, Janice, it's been wonderful talking with you today. Thank you so much for your work, your voice, and continuing to push this conversation forward. Thank you for listening to the Diversity Pivot podcast. My hope is that you walked away with a tangible tool, insight, or information that you can share with other allies on the journey. If you liked this week's episode, please leave us a review. Your feedback means a tremendous amount to us. We'll be back next week with another hot topic.